The invasion was supposed to be a swift, flawless victory. The alien armada descended like a storm across Earth's skies, their ships blotting out the sun as they spread destruction with precision. Most cities fell in hours, their defenses crushed under superior technology and ruthless tactics. Humanity's resistance shattered before it could even begin. For the invaders, victory was already sealed. But in the rubble of a once bustling city, something unexpected happened. Jackson Cole, a former soldier turned scavenger, crouched behind a crumbling wall, breathing heavy, every nerve screaming with tension. His unit had been wiped out hours earlier, leaving him alone, wounded, and hunted. The alien forces, called the Varkans, were thorough in their sweeps, crushing any flicker of rebellion before it sparked. Jackson knew better than to fight, to risk another hopeless charge. Survival was all that mattered. His fingers tightened around the cold metal of a rusted rifle, an old human relic from before the invasion. The Varkans had never expected humans to still be capable of resistance, much less to fight back with such desperate cunning. Their arrogance was their weakness. A squad of Varkans marched down the street, their tall, insect-like forms moving with calculated menace. Their weapons emitted soft blue glows, firing bolts that disintegrated anything they touched. Jackson's heart pounded. He steadied his breath and raised his rifle. The first shot was a crack that shattered the silence and split the calm the invaders had grown used to. One of the Varkans fell, its compound eyes widening in shock before it collapsed. The rest stopped, stunned for a heartbeat. And then chaos. The humans hiding in shadows all over the city erupted in defiance. Guns flared, traps sprung, and screams echoed in the shattered streets. The Varkans' confidence shattered like glass. Jackson fired again, each bullet a message, a warning that humanity was not defeated, not broken. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and desperate enough to fight back even when the odds were death. But the price was steep. The Varkans retaliated with brutal force. Buildings crumbled, innocent lives were lost, and the city turned into a burning battlefield. Yet in the center of it all, Jackson felt a fire ignite in his chest, a fierce, unyielding rage that refused to bow. This was no longer about survival. It was about sending a message. Humans fight, and they do not give up. The invasion might have been declared a success, but the war was far from over. Jackson didn't know how many of his kind were left, but hearing the gunfire swelling around him told him this wasn't just his fight anymore. Somewhere deep in the ruins, others were rising. Fighters, scavengers, even ordinary people forced into warriors by fear and loss. The Varkans had thought Earth was theirs for the taking, but every bullet Jackson fired cracked their illusion of easy conquest. The alien soldiers regrouped quickly. Their leader, a towering figure named Cathar, barked orders in a harsh, clicking language. The Varkans had weapons that could melt steel and senses sharper than any predator on Earth, but they weren't prepared for the raw, brutal chaos of human resistance. Jackson saw it in their eyes, the flicker of doubt, the unsteady stance as they faced something they couldn't just blast away. But Jackson was no hero. He was angry, yes, but mostly scared. Every time he pulled the trigger, he risked death. His muscles burned from running and fighting. His throat was raw from shouting commands to nearby fighters he didn't even know. A shard of glass tore his arm, and blood slicked his fingers. But he didn't stop. Pain was just another thing to push through. Amid the smoke and fire, Jackson caught sight of a small girl, no older than 10, trapped under a fallen beam. Without thinking, he dropped his rifle and sprinted over. His hands shook as he lifted the heavy debris, the Varkan patrol closing in behind him. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, but she didn't scream. "Run!" Jackson shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. She nodded, trusting him without question. They darted through the maze of destruction, dodging patrols and collapsing buildings. For a moment, Jackson felt the weight of the world in his chest, the lives lost, the destruction wrought by the invaders, and the future that might never come. But then the girl squeezed his hand, a quiet reminder that some part of humanity was still fighting to survive. Behind them, the Varkans intensified their hunt. Cathar's voice echoed through the comms, ordering ruthless sweeps and executions. "Crush them all," the command hissed. "Show no mercy." Jackson knew mercy was a luxury long gone from this war. Yet somewhere beneath the endless violence, something stubborn and fierce was growing in the humans' hearts. It was that spark, that refusal to die quietly, that would change everything. As night fell, the city became a cage of shadows and gunfire. But Jackson wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The night had fallen like a heavy shroud over the ruined city, turning streets into dark corridors of fear and uncertainty. Jackson crouched behind the battered remains of what used to be a street lamp, the faint flicker of firelight casting jagged shadows across his sweat-slicked face. The small girl he had saved clung tightly to his jacket, silent but alert, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and trust. He had no idea where they could go now. Every alleyway could lead to a trap, every ruined building a potential death trap. The Varkans were relentless. Their patrols moved with terrifying precision, sweeping through the rubble like ghosts hunting for prey. Their insectoid forms, glistening under the firelight, emitted a low, clicking sound that Jackson had come to hate more than the sting of bullets or the cries of the dying. But it was their cold efficiency that chilled him deepest. They didn't hesitate, they didn't pause, and they didn't show mercy. Jackson's mind raced. The city was lost, there was no doubt about that. The Varkans had all but claimed it as their own, but in the darkness, the flicker of human resistance burned brighter than ever. The firefight earlier had spread news through the ruined neighborhoods, news that the invaders could be stopped, that humans could fight back. He glanced at the girl. "What's your name?" he asked softly, careful not to startle her. "Leela," she whispered, barely audible. Jackson nodded. "We're going to get you somewhere safe, Lila. I promise he didn't know where that was, but hope was the only thing stronger than fear now." Suddenly, a harsh sound cracked through the air, the unmistakable bark of Varkan voice commands. Jackson pressed Lila closer, his heart pounding in his ears. A squad was closing in fast. He cursed silently. Their hiding place was compromised. He grabbed his rifle, which had been lying on the ground beside him. Its cold, worn metal felt reassuring in his hands. The weapon was outdated, barely functional compared to Varkan tech, but it was a reminder of humanity's resilience, of a world before the invasion. It was all he had. He peered around the corner, spotting the advancing Varkans. The squad was moving with deadly grace, their weapons glowing ominously. Jackson counted 5 of them, enough to overwhelm him if he didn't act fast. With a sudden burst of courage, Jackson fired. The rifle cracked like thunder in the still night, a sharp burst of light in the darkness. One Varkan's head jerked violently as the bullet struck, but the others barely hesitated. The blue energy bolts from their weapons slammed into the walls near him, sending debris flying. Jackson grabbed Lila's hand. "Run!" he shouted, dragging her into the maze of collapsed buildings. They weaved through narrow gaps, their lungs burning, adrenaline searing through their veins. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, heavy footsteps, alien voices, the electric hum of deadly weapons. They burst into an old subway station, its entrance partially collapsed, but still passable. Jackson pushed the debris aside with desperate strength, pulling Lila down the dark stairwell. The stale, cold air of the tunnels surrounded them like a shroud. They paused in the shadows, catching their breath. Jackson's eyes adjusted to the dim light, searching for signs of life. The tunnels were empty, for now. He pressed a hand to Lila's back, trying to soothe her trembling. "We'll be safe here," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. The underground was a maze, but it was also a trap if the Varkans discovered it. Jackson knelt, pulling a small pack from his jacket. Inside were bits of scavenged supplies, canned food, water, a few rounds of ammunition, and an old map of the city's underground system. He unfolded it carefully, the paper creased and worn. The resistance had made some attempts to use the tunnels as hideouts and supply routes. Jackson traced his finger along a faded line that led to an abandoned military bunker on the outskirts of the city. If they could reach it, there might be weapons, medical supplies, even other survivors. But it was a long, dangerous trek through Varkan-controlled territory. He looked down at Lila. "We have to move at first light," he said. "Rest now. We'll need all our strength." She nodded, settling against the damp wall. Jackson stayed awake, listening to the distant sounds of the city, the crackle of fires, the faint murmur of alien patrols, the sobs and whispers of survivors hiding in shadows. Memories flooded him. The faces of his fallen comrades, the family he'd lost, the life before the invasion. He clenched his fists. The Varkans had come to break humanity's spirit, to claim Earth as theirs. But that spirit still burned. Jackson's resolve hardened. The invasion might have seemed like a success for the aliens, but with every life that fought back, with every bullet fired in defiance, humanity's story was far from over. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore, he was fighting to reclaim a world stolen by monsters, and the first shot was only the beginning. The first light of dawn crept through the cracked ceiling of the underground tunnel, casting pale shadows over Jackson and Lila. The city above was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath before the storm. Jackson knew better. This was the calm before another brutal wave. The Varkans didn't rest, and neither could they. He shook off the exhaustion gnawing at his muscles, loading his rifle with the few bullets he had left. Lila stirred beside him, rubbing sleep from her eyes, but her resolve was steady. For a child her age, she had already seen too much. But somehow, she had survived. That survival was what Jackson clung to, the fragile hope that not all was lost. "We need to move," he whispered, scanning the tunnel entrance for any signs of patrols. "Stick close, and don't make a sound." The journey through the underground was a nightmare of darkness and uncertainty. The tunnels twisted and turned like a labyrinth, their walls cracked and damp, dripping water that echoed like distant footsteps. Every sound set Jackson's nerves on edge. He feared a misstep could draw the Varkans closer, and this time they might not be so merciful. Lila's hand in his was a small anchor in the cold, alien world they found themselves trapped in. She asked questions quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are they? Why do they want to hurt us?" Jackson's heart ached at the innocence lost. He didn't have answers, only bitter truths. "They don't care about us," he said, voice rough with weariness. "They want to take our home, but we won't let them." Hours passed in the darkness as they navigated the tunnels, avoiding weak beams and piles of rubble. At one point, a sudden clang echoed nearby, and Jackson froze, heart thundering. Shadows shifted ahead, Varkan patrols searching the underground with cold precision. Jackson pressed Lila against the wall, pulling her behind a rusted ventilation grate. The patrol passed by, their insectoid forms looming close enough to feel the cold hum of their weapons. Jackson's breath hitched, but he stayed still, praying they wouldn't be discovered. When the footsteps faded, he exhaled slowly. "We have to keep moving," he said. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the old military bunker marked on the map. The heavy steel door hung open, its hinges rusted but intact. Jackson pushed it aside with a grunt, revealing a dark, cavernous space inside. Forgotten weapons, ration packs, and faded photographs pinned to the walls, reminders of a world that had slipped away. Jackson's fingers trembled as he rummaged through crates, pulling out rifles, ammo, and makeshift explosives. This was a lifeline, a chance to fight back properly. Lila watched silently, her eyes wide as she took in the weapons. "Will this help us win?" she asked softly. Jackson looked at her, fighting the weariness threatening to break him. "It's a start," he said. "We'll need more than just weapons. We need people. We need hope." They weren't alone for long. As Jackson prepared the bunker, muffled footsteps echoed in the tunnel outside. A small group of survivors, broken, exhausted, but alive, crept inside. Eyes filled with fear and relief, they looked to Jackson, sensing a leader in the man who had defied the invaders. Jackson knew this was more than survival now. This was a spark of resistance, something the Varkans had not expected. The invasion might have been declared a success on the surface, but in the shadows, the fight was just beginning. He met the eyes of each survivor, silently promising them one thing. They would fight. They would resist. They would take back their world, no matter the cost. Because humanity didn't just survive. Humanity fought back. The survivors gathered around the dim glow of a flickering lantern, deep inside the bunker, their faces etched with exhaustion and the scars of loss. Jackson stood before them, rifle slung over his shoulder, feeling the heavy weight of responsibility settle on his chest. They were a ragged group, civilians, former soldiers, scavengers, but what they shared was raw determination. The kind that could ignite a revolution or burn them all alive. Jackson's voice cut through the silence. "The Varkans think this war's over," he said, eyes scanning the crowd. "They don't know what humans are capable of. We're not just survivors. We're fighters. And we'll make them regret every step they took on our soil." There was a murmur of agreement, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Among the survivors was a grizzled man named Marcus, once an engineer, who stepped forward. "I know this city's tunnels better than anyone," he said, voice rough but steady. "We can use them to move unseen, strike where they least expect it." Jackson nodded. "Good. We need to hit their supply lines, disrupt their communications, cut off their advantage." A woman named Sarah, a former medic, raised her hand. "We're outnumbered and outgunned, but if we can hit them with hit-and-run attacks, we can bleed them, make them waste resources." Jackson's mind raced, piecing together a plan that was desperate but possible. "We'll split into small teams," he said. "Strikes at dawn and dusk. Use the tunnels for cover. We'll take what we can, steal what we need, and vanish before they even realize we're there." Lila sat quietly nearby, clutching a worn teddy bear, watching the adults with wide eyes. Jackson caught her gaze and gave a small nod, a silent promise that they would fight for a future she deserved. But the cost of resistance was already clear. The bunker's walls seemed to close in, haunted by memories of those who didn't make it. Jackson felt the weight of every lost life, every family torn apart by the invasion. That night, as the group settled into a tense rest, Jackson sat apart, sharpening a knife with methodical precision. The cold metal gleamed, reflecting the harsh reality they faced. He thought about the first shot he'd fired, the sound that shattered the invaders' confidence and ignited a war they never wanted. But for every victory, there was blood. For every step forward, a price to pay. A sudden noise snapped Jackson's attention. He tensed, gripping the knife tighter as footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the bunker. A shadow appeared in the doorway. A young man, barely more than a boy, breathless and wide-eyed. "They're coming!" the boy gasped. "A patrol found the safe house. They're heading this way." Panic rippled through the survivors. Jackson stood, voice calm but urgent. "Get weapons ready. We hold this ground." The Varkan patrol didn't take long. They spilled into the bunker with brutal efficiency, their glowing weapons raised. Jackson fired first, the sharp crack of his rifle ringing out. The battle was chaos, bullets and energy bolts cutting through the confined space, screams mixing with the metallic scent of blood and smoke. Jackson fought with every ounce of strength, his body moving on instinct. The invaders were strong and fast, but the humans had grit, a ferocity born from desperation and rage. Each enemy that fell was a victory, but every wound stung deeper. Lila huddled behind a crate, eyes wide with terror. Jackson caught her gaze once, offering a fierce smile before turning back to the fight. When the dust settled, the bunker was wrecked. Several survivors lay injured, some already lost. The Varkans had retreated, but the message was clear. Humanity's resistance was no longer a nuisance, it was a threat. Jackson knelt beside the wounded, pressing bandages with hands that trembled but didn't falter. "This is only the beginning," he said softly. "We fight, we survive, and one day we take back what's ours." Outside, the city burned under alien skies, but deep below, a spark of rebellion blazed in the darkness. The bunker lay in ruin, its once solid walls now scarred with scorch marks and shattered debris. Jackson moved through the wreckage with grim determination, the bitter taste of loss heavy on his tongue. The cost of defiance had never been clearer. Every face he passed bore the marks of pain, exhaustion, and a stubborn refusal to surrender. Lila was nowhere to be seen. His heart plunged as he searched frantically, calling her name in the dim, smoke-choked corridors. Panic rose like a wildfire. She was the reason he fought, the fragile ember of hope in the darkness. And now she was gone. "Lila!" he shouted again, voice cracking. A faint sound caught his ear, a soft whimper from beneath a pile of rubble near the entrance. Jackson dropped to his knees, throwing debris aside with desperate hands. There she was, dirt-smudged and wide-eyed, clutching her teddy bear as if it were a lifeline. He pulled her close, his breath ragged with relief and fury. "Don't ever do that again," he growled, his voice rough. "You scared me." She looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Jackson. I didn't want to be left behind." The bond between them was more than survival. It was the fragile thread holding him to his humanity. But there was no time to linger. Outside, the city's ruins moaned under the weight of alien occupation. The Varkans were tightening their grip, hunting any signs of rebellion with merciless precision. Jackson knew their next move had to be smarter, fiercer. He gathered the survivors in what was left of the bunker's main chamber. Faces were drawn tight with fear, but in their eyes burned the same defiance Jackson felt clawing inside him. "We're down one safe house," he began, voice low but steady. "But we're not out of this. The Varkans want to break us, but they'll find something stronger than steel and fire." He let the silence hang, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We need to hit harder, strike where they least expect it. They're arrogant, thinking their technology makes them invincible. They don't understand what it means to fight for your home." Marcus the engineer stepped forward. "I've been working on some makeshift explosives," he said, holding up a crude device. "Not as powerful as their weapons, but enough to cause chaos." Jackson nodded. "Good. We'll use sabotage, hit supply lines, disrupt their comms, force them to spread thinner." Sarah, the medic, looked at him with tired eyes. "It's risky. We're outnumbered, outgunned. We'll lose more people." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I know, but sitting here waiting to die isn't an option. Every moment we wait, they grow stronger." Plans were made in hushed tones, maps spread over cracked tables. The survivors divided into teams, each with a mission to cripple the alien occupation. Jackson took charge of the most dangerous, an assault on a heavily fortified supply depot on the city's edge. Lila watched him quietly, clutching his jacket. "Promise me you'll come back," she said, voice trembling. Jackson knelt to meet her gaze, the weight of his promise sinking deep. "I will," he said firmly, "for you and for all of us." That night, as the city slept under the watchful eyes of alien sentinels, Jackson prepared. The rifle in his hands felt heavier than ever, loaded with the determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. The streets outside were silent, but Jackson knew it was the silence before the storm. Jackson moved like a shadow through the ruined outskirts of the city, every step measured, every breath controlled. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on the target ahead, the Varkans' supply depot. If they could cripple it, even for a little while, it would disrupt their entire operation, buying time for the scattered pockets of resistance to regroup and fight back harder. The depot loomed ahead, a massive fortress of metal and alien technology. Blue lights flickered along its walls, and heavily armed sentinels patrolled the perimeter like predators. Jackson crouched low behind shattered crates, scanning for weak points. The Varkans were ruthless, but arrogance blinded them. They underestimated humans, our tenacity, our capacity to endure and strike where it hurt most. Jackson pulled the makeshift explosives Marcus had crafted from his pack. They weren't much, far less powerful than the Varkans' weapons, but enough to cause chaos. He set the charges quietly at key structural points, hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. Each second counted. If caught, it would mean death, not just for him, but for the Resistance's hopes. He placed the last charge near a fuel storage unit, knowing its explosion would ripple through the depot like a shockwave. As he worked, distant footsteps echoed, a patrol making its rounds. Jackson froze, breath shallow, eyes locked on the approaching figures. The patrol was too close. Without hesitation, Jackson raised his rifle and fired. The crack of the gunshot shattered the silence. One Varkan dropped, but the others turned, weapons glowing and ready. He sprinted for cover, bullets and energy bolts tearing into the walls around him. The battle was fierce but brief. Jackson's aim was true, and the patrol fell back, wounded and disoriented. With no time to waste, he triggered the explosives. The ground shook violently, flames licking the night sky as the depot erupted in a ball of fire and metal. Alarms blared, piercing the night as chaos exploded within the alien stronghold. Jackson didn't wait for the aftermath. He vanished into the maze of ruins, heart racing but burning with grim satisfaction. The depot's destruction was a message, a warning that humans fought back with ferocity the Varkans had not anticipated. Back at the bunker, the survivors heard the distant roar of the explosion. For a moment, silence fell. Then a cheer rose from the weary group. Jackson's strike had ignited a spark of hope that spread like wildfire, but the cost was already looming. The Varkans would retaliate, and when they did, the Resistance would face its toughest test yet. Jackson knew that the fight was far from over. This was just the first blow in a war that would decide the fate of humanity. The explosion rocked the city's outskirts like a thunderclap, shaking windows and rattling bones even in the bunker deep below. Jackson pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, the distant glow of flames flickering through the cracks. The raid had been a success, a crushing blow to the Varkan supply lines, but the victory came with a heavy price. The alien response was swift and brutal. Through the cracked communications device, distorted alien commands echoed like a dark storm gathering. Cathar's voice, sharp and commanding, warned of reprisals. The Varkans wouldn't tolerate defiance. They would hunt the Resistance like vermin and crush every spark of rebellion without hesitation. Jackson gathered the survivors, their faces pale but resolute. "They'll come for us," he said grimly. "We need to be ready." Marcus worked quickly to reinforce the bunker's defenses, rigging crude alarms and traps. Sarah tended to the wounded, her hands steady despite the rising tension. Everyone moved with a nervous urgency, the calm before the inevitable storm. Lila stayed close to Jackson, her eyes wide but filled with a newfound determination. "We can't lose, right?" she asked quietly. Jackson knelt to meet her gaze, swallowing the fear knotting his throat. "We can't," he said firmly. "Not now, not ever." Hours passed in tense silence, punctuated by distant rumblings and the crackle of radio static. Then, without warning, the first wave hit. The bunker's alarms screamed through the darkness as Varkan forces descended like a tidal wave of destruction. Energy weapons lit the tunnels, searing through walls and tearing apart anything in their path. The survivors scrambled to their positions, hearts pounding in unison with the rising chaos. Jackson stood at the forefront, rifle blazing, voice sharp as he barked orders. The fight was savage and relentless, each inch of ground paid for in blood and sweat. The Varkans were methodical killers, but the humans fought with a desperation born from having nowhere left to run. In the midst of the chaos, Jackson spotted Lila huddled behind a stack of crates, her face streaked with dirt and tears. His chest tightened. He fought his way to her, pulling her close and whispering fiercely, "Stay with me." The battle raged on, but the survivors' resistance began to falter under the overwhelming assault. Walls crumbled, weapons jammed, and the air thickened with smoke and fear. Just as the Varkans were about to breach the last barricade, a deafening roar shook the tunnels, a secondary explosion from the city above. Flames burst through the ceiling, forcing the invaders to momentarily retreat. Jackson seized the chance. "Fall back! Regroup at the eastern tunnel!" he commanded. The survivors fled through winding passages, wounds heavy but spirits unbroken. Outside, the city was a raging inferno, the sky painted with fire and ash. Jackson looked back once, eyes burning with defiance. The Varkans might have power, but humanity had something more dangerous, a will to survive that no alien force could crush. This was a war they would fight to the last breath. The fire above cast an eerie glow that seeped into the tunnels as Jackson led the survivors through the winding maze beneath the shattered city. Their feet echoed on cracked concrete, hearts pounding not just from exertion, but from the raw, gnawing fear of what was hunting them. The distant screams and thunder of collapsing buildings were a grim reminder that the Varkans would not rest until every last human was crushed. Jackson glanced back at Lila, who struggled to keep pace, her small frame wobbling under exhaustion. He reached out, steadying her with a firm grip. "Almost there," he promised, though even he wasn't certain. The eastern tunnel was supposed to lead to a safer hideout, but nothing felt safe anymore. The group moved silently, voices swallowed by the weight of the night. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a potential threat. The Varkans had turned the city into a labyrinth of death, their patrols relentless, and their technology far beyond anything humans could match. But Jackson had learned something vital in the chaos. Humans were unpredictable. They could fight with savage intelligence, striking where the enemy least expected. And that was their weapon. As they rounded a corner, the faint hum of machinery grew louder. Ahead lay a forgotten factory, long abandoned before the invasion. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and shelter meant a chance to plan the next move. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of rust. Jackson lit a small lantern, its flickering flame casting monstrous shadows on the walls. The survivors gathered, their faces etched with exhaustion but burning with a fierce determination. "We hold here," Jackson said, voice low but firm. "We regroup, we rest, and then we strike again." Marcus immediately began inspecting the old machinery, searching for anything usable, broken pipes, discarded tools, anything that could be turned into weapons or traps. Sarah checked on the injured, her hands gentle despite the grim surroundings. Lila curled up beside Jackson, her small fingers clutching his arm. "Will we really win?" she asked softly. Jackson swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing a smile. "We have to," he said, "for everyone we've lost, and for those still fighting." But as the hours passed, the weight of the fight pressed down on him. He knew the Varkans would come back, harder and more prepared. The raid on the depot had been a spark, but sparks could be crushed underfoot. He paced the factory floor, thoughts heavy. Somewhere deep inside, a burning question gnawed at him. How long could they hold on? How many more would have to die before the tide turned? Outside, the alien patrols swept through the city, their glowing eyes scanning the darkness. But inside the factory, a stubborn flame of resistance burned. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was war. And Jackson was ready to lead it. The factory's silence was deceptive. Beneath the broken machinery and rusted pipes, the survivors fortified their fragile sanctuary with grim determination. Jackson moved like a ghost through the shadows, his mind a whirlwind of plans and possibilities. Every face he passed bore the scars of war, some fresh, others deep as the weight of years lost. But in their eyes burned a common fire, the refusal to give up. The day was just beginning to break when the first warning came, a faint vibration in the ground, a low hum that set nerves on edge. Jackson's hand dropped to his rifle instinctively. The Varkans were coming. He gathered the survivors, whispering orders that stoked the embers of courage. "We hold this place," he said. "We fight for every inch. No surrender." Outside, the alien forces advanced, their ships casting long shadows across the city ruins. The Varkans moved with cold precision, their weapons glowing ominously. But the humans had something no alien could understand: sheer savage will. As the first wave of attackers breached the factory's perimeter, the air exploded with gunfire and energy blasts. Jackson fought at the front, every muscle coiled and ready. The battle was brutal, a dance of death in the dim light. Humans ducked and dodged, firing makeshift explosives and ripping apart the alien machines with whatever they could find. Amid the chaos, Jackson caught sight of Lila, a small figure darting through the smoke and rubble, helping the wounded with Sarah's guidance. Her eyes were fierce, no longer just a scared child, but a symbol of hope that drove him forward. But the cost was steep. One by one, survivors fell, their blood staining the broken floor. The Varkans adapted quickly, using advanced tactics and brutal force to press the assault. When the battle seemed lost, Jackson made a desperate decision. "Fall back!" he shouted. "Regroup at the tunnels." The survivors retreated, slipping into the underground maze just as the factory was engulfed in flames. The Varkans roared in frustration, their piercing cries echoing after them. Breathing hard in the suffocating darkness, Jackson knew the fight was far from over. The city was their battleground, but the war was bigger than any one place. He pressed a hand to Lila's shoulder. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning." In the depths of the ruins, with the fires burning above, humanity's defiant heart still beat strong. The tunnels swallowed them whole, the claustrophobic darkness pressing against Jackson's skin like a living thing. The distant roar of the burning factory faded into a muffled echo, replaced by the steady drip of water and the soft shuffle of hurried footsteps. Every breath they took tasted of dust and desperation. But there was no time to slow down, not with the Varkans hunting them relentlessly. Jackson led the survivors through the labyrinthine passages, each turn familiar yet treacherous. He knew the tunnels like the back of his hand, every crumbling wall and hidden alcove, but the burden of guiding so many weighed heavily on him. Lila stayed close, her small hand clasped tightly in his, grounding him in the chaos. "We have to keep moving," Jackson said, his voice low but urgent. "The Varkans won't stop until they find us." The group moved with silent precision, nerves stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. Jackson's mind raced through their dwindling options. Supplies were running low, and the constant fighting had left them exhausted and wounded. Yet even in the face of despair, something unbreakable pulsed beneath their fear, a fierce determination to survive and fight another day. Suddenly, a distant rumble vibrated through the tunnels, shaking loose debris from the ceiling. The survivors froze, hearts pounding. Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Collapse ahead," he warned, scanning the path. "We need to find another way." They backtracked carefully, turning down a narrow passage that led deeper underground. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the earth itself was warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back now. As they pressed on, Jackson spotted faint glimmers of light ahead, old emergency lamps, flickering weakly but still alive. Relief washed over him. The passage opened into a wider chamber where a rusted maintenance hatch offered a possible exit. Jackson pushed the hatch open with a grunt, revealing a shaft that led up toward the city surface. "This way," he urged, helping the survivors climb one by one. Emerging from the darkness, they found themselves in a forgotten park overgrown with weeds and ash, the sky above obscured by thick smoke. The city lay in ruins around them, silent except for the distant rumble of alien engines. Jackson took a deep breath, the harsh air biting at his lungs. The fight was far from over, but this small victory, a breath of open air, was a spark of hope. "We make camp here," Jackson said, scanning the horizon. "We rest, we heal, and then we strike back." Lila looked up at him, eyes wide but fierce. "We'll win, won't we?" Jackson forced a tired smile. "We have to." The city's shadows stretched long, but beneath them, the fire of resistance burned brighter than ever. Jackson stood at the edge of the ruined city, the acrid smoke curling in the cold wind, carrying the scent of fire and loss. Around him, the ragged survivors gathered, battered but unbroken, faces marked by grief, but eyes burning with fierce determination. The war had taken everything from them, homes, families, innocence, yet none of it had crushed their spirit. The Varkans had come believing Earth was theirs for the taking, a simple conquest won by superior technology and merciless force. But humanity had shown them something they couldn't understand: defiance. A savage, unyielding will to fight back, no matter the cost. Jackson looked down at Lila, now older and stronger, her gaze steady and fearless. She was the future, a reminder of why they had fought so hard and lost so much. "This is our world," he said quietly. "No matter how dark it gets, no matter how many times we fall, we rise." The resistance had grown from desperate, scattered pockets into a force the Varkans feared. The invaders' grip on the city was shattered, their supply lines crippled, their arrogance broken. The first shot Jackson fired had ignited a war they had not expected, a war that was far from over, but one that humanity was beginning to win. As dawn broke, washing the city in pale light, Jackson raised his rifle, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of every lost friend, every fallen fighter, every shattered dream made into fuel for the fight ahead. The invasion had seemed like a success, for a moment. But the first human who fired back changed everything. And as long as that fire burned in their hearts, humanity would never be conquered. They were survivors. They were fighters. They were humans. And Earth would be theirs again.